You know, the trouble with all of these high-end investigators is that they don't realize that all they need to do is use a simple bit of deductive logic and reasoning, precisely because they lack it themselves. Now, obviously, the first step is to eliminate those clues which do not match the scene and are merely red herrings. First and most obvious, the broken teacup. George Washington was murdered following, quote, a delightful tea party. There was plenty of reason for there to be a teacup on the scene, especially considering that it would have likely been broken in the ensuing scuffle. A foreign coin, however, that seems far more likely to be an incriminating object potentially dropped by our supposed murderer. A pass to Congress makes perfect sense. As president for 2 terms, our former commander likely would have had such an item on his person, even if he was officially in retirement and no longer involved in politics. Perhaps the pass was an old one. A bottle of whiskey. Perhaps slightly more incriminating, but not necessarily. After all, whiskey is sometimes drunk by the upper class. A novelty or an exotic deluxe good, if you will. That one can be declared plausible, for the time being, that is. Now, a paper with the word monocrat? That seems like a label, something that an assassin would have left behind to show the reason for their killing. It would appear that this is their way of threatening any who would agree with the fallen former president. Their way of pointing out what they believe to be wrong with him. A handkerchief? Unimportant. It could well have been dropped by he himself or by any other noble guest who happened to pass through the area. Such a thing is quite common and of no consequence, especially considering that it might well have been tossed aside during the actual murder. A revolutionary bullet. This is perhaps a bit more unusual. Washington, no doubt, would have scrapped all other revolutionary items by this time, and even if he had kept some as keepsakes, why would there be one in his sitting room? This one deserves consideration. A pair of dice? Again, rather plausible. There is not much that might necessarily connect them to any murderer, but then again, there is not much that wouldn't either. A feather? A feather serves no use, unless one were to assume it to come from one of the Native Americans, and to assume as such would be foolish, as only one among their number was listed as one of the suspects, one little turtle, and he was in no way to be implicated, no motive existed, as he formed quite the series of treaties and truces with the American people. A copy of the Constitution? Perfectly reasonable. Washington could have perfectly well kept such a document on him, either as a keepsake or in memoriam. On the other hand, in relation to the paper labeled monocrat, it could well be some form of a personal insult. With that in mind, the Constitution remains plausible. And so we are brought to the most incriminating pieces of evidence. A piece of paper saying Jacobin on it, and, of course, a note saying, "Today is the day." Together, these seem to indicate a connection directly to the Jacobins, the most radical, ruthless, and terroristic of the political groups formed in the wake of the French Revolution. Such indicates that it was the French, or someone with a close relation to them, who was responsible for the murder of George Washington. So, let's review what we know. All of the unlikely clues being eliminated. We have potential connections to the French, specifically the Jacobins. We have a foreign coin, also potentially connecting to the French. We have a revolutionary bullet, which implies that whoever it was that did the murder was in fact a former revolutionary. We have an accusation of George Washington being a monocrat, indicating that the murderer was a pursuer of liberty, someone against any form of governmental figurehead. And we have a copy of the Constitution. Whoever this was seems to have been throwing the document in the former president's face as a sort of personal insult. The time has come to consider the suspects and determine just who it is that is, in fact, guilty.
And his name is John C.